Hello, welcome to the Tablets webinar this evening. We're going to be discussing a bit of a difficult topic, to be honest. Safe in faith, addressing domestic abuse in church communities. We never hide from discussing these topics, and if it helps somebody along the way, then we're very grateful for that. Our speakers this evening are Stephanie MacGillivray, Senior Officer at Caritas International, us and Nikki Dhillon-Keane, who's a therapist, trainer, author, and activist. And we're going to have an in-depth discussion on tackling domestic abuse within the church communities. We're drawing on their experience and expertise in organisational identity, mission, women's leadership, and gender equality. And we're going to be looking particularly at the realities of domestic abuse in faith settings, the challenges survivors face, and how the churches can really take action to create safer, more supportive environments. And we'll also be looking at the role of faith and healing and advocacy in this area. So it's really good to see you, Stephanie and Nikki. Thank you so much for doing this. The thought being that although there's not many people on this call, we are going to load this on later on onto YouTube with all sort of helplines and so forth, should people be interested. So with that in mind, if you've got any questions for either of the speakers, please either run them through the chat box, or if you want to just unmute yourself at some point in the call, and please just ask your questions. That's not a problem at all. Welcome, Stephanie. Welcome, Nikki. Over to you.
Great. Thank you, Amanda, and good evening, everyone. So my name is Steph, as Amanda has said, and I work at Caritas Internationalis, based at the General Secretariat in Rome. And it's really an honor to be able to speak with Nikki this evening about a topic which is quite complex and challenging, but is really, really important. So we're very grateful also for the opportunity to be able to open this discussion and to have it shared more widely on YouTube afterwards. So we thought we'd begin just sort of by sort of setting the scene a bit. And shortly I will ask Nikki to introduce herself as well. But we just wanted to say a bit about why we're talking about this today. And the reason is that unfortunately this issue continues to be prolific in society across all different societies. There's no one single area or country which is, better or worse. Unfortunately, this is a worldwide issue. Indeed, the UK government has called it a national emergency. We were all, of course, obviously shocked by the case of Gisèle Pelicot in France this year, during the trial which took place this year. Recently, here in Italy, there have been a spate of femicides, especially of young women who were killed by boyfriends, ex-boyfriends, who were also young men as well. In 2023, here in Italy, there was a film made called C'è ancora domani, which means that we still have tomorrow. And this highlighted the historical issue of domestic abuse as sort of an accepted part of society. During the COVID-19 pandemic, unfortunately, again, violence against women, especially domestic abuse, skyrocketed, and women were it became more unsafe in their own homes due to having to be closed in their own homes, and in speaking with Nikki as well before this, we also explored that. Domestic abuse is, of course, just one aspect of violence against women in the broader sense in the world, and it takes many different forms. And it really is important that we continue to talk about it because when it is kept as a stigma, as a taboo subject, that's when it's allowed to thrive. And so by talking about it, we open the conversation, we increase our understanding, and most importantly, we can learn about how to help people who may be victims. And ultimately, the aim would be to prevent and end this violence against women. And so, with all of that said, we are in very, very good hands with Nikki Dhillon-Keane here this evening, who is one of the leading experts on this topic. She is a therapist, author, activist, and has set up Safe in Faith, which I will now invite Nikki to tell us a bit more about, as well as to tell us a bit more about yourself. Thanks, Nikki.
Well, thank you for that very generous introduction, Steph. I always say I prefer the term specialist to expert. I'm never comfortable with the term expert, but yes, I am leading the work of Safe in Faith at the moment, which is a project of Caritas Westminster, although we are now working across dioceses across England and Wales as a new development. So we're not just working in Westminster Diocese at the moment. I'm also involved in other areas of the church and have been for some years now, looking at this topic. I can see Raymond on the call here, and CSAN has a Domestic Abuse Alliance, which is a legacy of the work of the Bishops' Conference, the Domestic Abuse Working Group of the Bishops' Conference. And so I work with Raymond on that. And also I can see some sisters from the National Board of Catholic Women, and we have a Violence Against Women committee there addressing this subject and other subjects. And the National Board of Catholic Women have actually been addressing this for decades. And a lot of the work we do is really standing on the shoulders of the women there who've started this work within the church. So that's a little bit of context as to where Safe in Faith sits in the other work of the church. In the context of why we need to do this is, as you quite rightly said, Steph, the British government have called violence against women a national emergency because the numbers are so shocking. And currently, in terms of domestic abuse, currently 1 in 4 women and roughly 1 in 7 men in the UK are impacted by domestic abuse, are subjected to domestic abuse during their lifetime. And around every 5 days, a woman is murdered by her partner or ex-partner in the UK. I think one of the things I often like to say about this is that we talk often about femicides, and it's important to talk about those statistics because they help us understand how serious the problem is. But behind these statistics are women. And when we're talking about death, we tend to talk about domestic abuse being fatal. All too often it is. But we don't talk about the death of the soul that happens when somebody cannot live their God-given life because they're being controlled in everything they do. And I think that's another kind of death that happens, which we need to be mindful of. And sometimes there's no physical violence involved in that. So we need to be mindful of all the different forms that coercive control can take.
Absolutely. Thank you. And those, as you say, the statistics are just absolutely shocking. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men are affected, you say, are victims of domestic abuse. And every 5 days, a woman is killed by her partner or ex-partner. And that means for us as in our faith communities, you know, in Catholic communities, but also in other communities of faith, you know, it means when you're just thinking about you go to, you know, for example, you go to mass on a Sunday, 1 in 4 of the women in that church are potentially victims. And that means, you know, maybe one person per bench, even if you count up the numbers. I mean, it's shocking. And we know that, as you say, it's an affront on the dignity of the human person, which is so crucial to of course, you know, the Christian faith, but as I say, of course, to other faith communities as well. You know, the importance of the soul in our living life, let alone, you know, afterwards. And so, as you say, it really it almost, I'm lost for words, I have to say, when you put it like that. I find it quite moving, actually. And so when you're working, for example, with Safe in Faith, um, I wondered, you know, in faith communities, in, for example, the Christian community, Catholic community, what are survivors saying? You know, obviously, of course, with the protection of identities as appropriate, but what are their experiences? And how are you know, priests or pastors or whoever able to deal with what's happening? You know, what is the reality of domestic abuse in the church?
That's a really good question, and the answer is incredibly varied. I've so Safe in Faith itself, we train psychotherapists and counselors, we train clergy and parish teams. We don't at the moment do any frontline work. And a lot of the other work I do, I'm working directly with victims and survivors, and most of them are Christian, and a lot of those are Catholic. And the stories I hear vary from people who've really been subjected to spiritual abuse when they've attempted to seek help within the church. And an example of that, a story that I tell quite often, and I've changed her name for safety. I call her Maggie when I talk about her. And Maggie and women like her are really a lot of the reason we set up Safe in Faith. Maggie was married for 27 years. And like so often the case, when she first got married, her husband was very charming and seemed really lovely. Because abusers tend to groom their victims into the relationship. He became more controlling. During the course of the marriage, he became violent, physically and sexually violent. And Maggie became very afraid, and she's very devout Catholic, and she turned to her parish priest for support and advice. And he said to her that she should think about what she's done to make him so angry, that she should pray to be a better wife, and he would pray for her, and that she should thank God for her suffering, because that's what made her holy. She realized that wasn't a safe or satisfying answer. So she went to her local domestic abuse service and told them everything. And they said to her that she should give up her faith. And of course, she couldn't do that. So she went back to her husband and was with him for another 5 years before I met her. And luckily, you know, from having support from within the church, she was able to seek safety. But that's, I think, on one extreme, what can happen. The other extreme is that I've had priests come to me saying, can you give therapy to this person? I'll pay for it. I've had people tell me that their priest saved their life. And And so, you know, there is potential for priests and other people working in parishes. I think there's a really important role for catechists as well, working at those moments of life transition and preparation for the sacraments, to be able to recognize when things might be happening at home that aren't safe. So what we know is that generally in the formation that priests have, there isn't really robust training about domestic abuse or other kinds of violence against women or trauma. So Safe in Faith, that there is training from the safeguarding point of view through safeguarding, and I do work with some safeguarding teams who do really excellent work there. But what we do at Safe in Faith is we provide training that takes a slightly different perspective. We look at the theology, we look at the spirituality, we look at how perpetrators will weaponize faith. And they know that they know that if someone has a strong faith, weaponizing that faith is really the most powerful way to control them. And so ideas like forgiveness and suffering, that, you know, priests will quite often preach about, I encourage them to consider that it's inevitable every time they're preaching about forgiveness or suffering, there are going to be victims and survivors and perpetrators listening to that homily. And I encourage them to consider how their words might be interpreted by those people.
Absolutely. I mean, taking that approach, I think, you know, having that religious literacy underneath what you're doing is so crucial, because as you say, you know, when there isn't that specialized formation available, the work that Safe in Faith does in training and formation, as you say, not just clergy, but also catechists, people with responsibility, essentially, or in positions where they're in contact with others in the parish, and in a trusted position as well. But also, you know, you look to a catechist as someone who understands what the church teaches. And as you look to a priest as someone who understands what the church teaches. And so this formation is really important. I mean, in my own work here in Caritas, I also work on women's empowerment in a general sense and globally. But for sure, this understanding of what the church actually teaches about specific issues, which are a bit, you know, challenging, they're not easy to talk about. And so people perhaps sometimes generalize or make assumptions. And so I think, you know, thank you for the work that Safe in Faith is doing on that formation. So that's obviously the work of your organization, which, as you say, you know, you're a specialist in this field, and you are highly trained to deal with some of the most sensitive issues. But I wonder what, you know, the rest of us can do. You know, what about the normal person who may not have that specialist training, but who perhaps has a concern about a friend or someone in the parish, or, you know, just someone who maybe wants to volunteer or learn more, or, you know, do their bit to try to fight this national emergency. What can we do? Do you have maybe some simple and practical actions that you can suggest at that sort of level as well?
Yeah, there's definitely things that people can do. We have information on our website for people to learn more about domestic abuse. And we have a very long list of some excellent resources and other organizations, some of them faith organizations, some of them secular organizations, all of which will help people to upskill themselves. We also have a signposting toolkit that was designed for use in parishes, but actually can be used by anybody, to help signpost people to the right help. One of the things that we say when we're training parish groups is we don't expect you to fix all of this. It can feel really overwhelming, and it can take a really large number of experts with, different professionals with different expertise to be able to support someone to safety. So we help people know where to signpost, but the role that people in parishes and clergy can have that those other experts can't have, is the role of saying the church stands with you, the role of saying God loves you and wants you to be safe. God does not ask us to stay in unsafe spaces. That's a quote from one of our, we have a panel of experts by experience. And this incredible woman, and this is a line that she came up with. She also contributed to my book on domestic abuse in churches. And she says this: God does not ask us to stay in unsafe spaces. And that's actually the first slide in my training for clergy, because that's the sort of foundational understanding that we need, is that the church, canon law says, do not stay in danger. Canon law supports people leaving and getting safe and taking their children to safety. A lot of people don't know this. A lot of people assume that they're going against the church and they have to choose, like Maggie had to choose. She described having to choose between her life and her everlasting soul. That was how it felt to her, that she had to choose between the two. And she chose to sacrifice the safety of her life in order to protect her everlasting soul. What we want people to know is that the church stands with justice. The church stands with victims and survivors and against abuse. And the church supports people seeking safety. The church never asks people to stay in danger.
I think those are really powerful words. And if, if more people understood it or knew it, perhaps it would create a sort of automatic change in people's minds. Because I think, you're right that that these misunderstandings mean that people make dangerous compromises. And I think, as I say, also in my own work, I know that this is something which affects church communities, but as I said before, communities of faith generally. I mean, earlier in the year, I went to a global conference where there were people, it was a sort of interfaith discussion, and they were speaking about how these teachings, as you mentioned, are sort of weaponized or misconstrued, to mislead, deliberately mislead, and to deliberately take people into places which are unsafe. And so, I wondered if you've done any sort of interfaith, or you've had any experience of this also across communities, because of course, our society is, it's a pluralistic society. We live in a very, very diverse culture. And so I'm wondering if there are ways in which sort of bringing those groups together could have some kind of a positive impact as well.
It certainly does. And, one of the things outside of the Catholic Church that I was involved in setting up is the Faith and VAUG, Violence Against Women and Girls Coalition. And that's an interfaith group of individuals and organizations, all working with the common goal. What I've found working with them is that we have so much in common. And often I find more in common with them than I might find with some other Catholics. So we do support each other very much. We work with members like Sikh Women's Aid. Um, I've also worked alongside Jewish Women's Aid, and actually the previous CEO of Jewish Women's Aid was one of the people whose ideas really fed in and was incredibly supportive when we were creating the first iteration of Safe in Faith, so a few years back. So it very much is something that we're aware that we need to work together on, and we need to work across different faiths, also across cultures. And one of the things that we're doing at the moment in Safe in Faith, we've got a project where I'm currently working with the Black Churches Domestic Abuse Forum. And with a few other organizations, with Catholic Action for Racial Justice, with Forward UK, and we will be consulting with some of the ethnic chaplaincies as well. And we're creating a 5th module for our training for clergy and parishes, which is going to be focusing on addressing domestic abuse across culture. Because what we've found is the ways in which the language that you need to use, the ways in which you need to talk about this can vary hugely, depending on different culture, and it's a problem that exists across cultures, but it can be manifested quite differently in different cultures. And there may be some harmful practices, for example, like forced marriage and so-called honor-based violence, which may form part of domestic abuse in some groups and not in others. So we need to have awareness of the huge diversity of victim survivors and perpetrators, also of people in parishes who are helping, and of clergy. And we have a wonderful diverse mix of clergy in our country. And so really looking at the complexity of all those different relationships across cultures and how we can make sure we're helping.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so important to work across cultures, because you realize also sometimes that, we said before, sometimes faith is weaponized, but culture is also sometimes weaponized to say, oh, well, this is just part of the culture, and for example, in my line of work where I work very internationally, sometimes in some very some of the poorest and most vulnerable communities in the world. And, of course, there are cultural sensitivities, and we're very, very careful about that. But one of the things where we're very clear that we don't compromise is that a harmful action is not classified as a cultural, sensitivity. And that's really, really important. And I mean, just to give one example of, sometimes some of this is also about just framing the narrative in a different way. And I remember one very, very clear example when it was a Muslim woman that I was talking to, and she said, sometimes just asking a question in a different way can completely change the way someone thinks about it, and also help to sort of bust the myths as well. And she said, instead of saying, what does the Muslim faith teach about female genital mutilation? She says, what does the Muslim faith teach about ending female genital mutilation? And this is just adding that one word is so powerful, because it makes you realize, oh, okay, yeah, like this isn't part of the faith or part of, the culture. It's a harmful activity. So it's interesting about that, and working across different cultures. We can learn that language as well and frame the narrative in different ways.
Yeah.
So thank you for those really practical actions. And I think afterwards you said that you'll share links to your website and everything, which can be posted with the YouTube link. But I wondered, as well as, how can we help? How can we support victims, or how can we raise awareness in our communities, etc.? In the end, sometimes when we're for example, I talk about women's leadership in my job, and I said, it would be nice if I didn't have to talk about this. It would be nice if this wasn't an issue anymore. And it would be more than nice if we never ever had to speak about domestic abuse ever again. So I wonder, with the dream being that this would doesn't exist, how can we do that? How can we prevent this happening in the first place? And how do we stop it?
I mean, that's really the most difficult question of all. And I think, we share the same dream that one day our jobs will be unnecessary, and we'll have nothing to do. And that can feel very, very long way off. I think one of the things we need to do is not be afraid of asking the hard questions. I think it's very easy to see this in terms of families with problems or individuals with problems. When we look at the statistics of how often this happens, we can't really get away with looking at it like that. We have to ask how it is that we live in a society, that we're part of a society, that we're part of a culture where this can happen so frequently. And while we do need to acknowledge that men are victimized, and sometimes they're victimized by other men, and sometimes they're victimized by women, and we do include that in our training, and we do signpost to support for male victims and survivors. But we also have to ask why it is that the numbers are so unbalanced, why it is that it's so many more women who are victimized by men. And what it is, when we look at the causal relationship between patriarchal structures and femicide. And, so there's patriarchal structures, and there's misogyny, and there's rape culture, and there's harms against women, culminating in femicide. I think if we're not brave enough to ask those questions, to ask what is it about our role that is both causal and curative? What can we do to mitigate some of those power imbalances we see around us? Because until we are willing to do that, we can carry on supporting victims and survivors. We can carry on training people, but I don't see this ending. In fact, I see very, very disturbing things coming out of youth culture. And, concepts like the manosphere and, the incel culture, and the influence of people like Andrew Tate, which I think is as damaging to young men and boys as it is to women, because it encourages them to harm women, but it's actually harming them as well. One of the things that we're working in Safe and Faith, we're working with a secular organization that goes into schools to do workshops in schools, to upskill teachers, to be able to address these issues more confidently. And also they do workshops with young people themselves. And we're working with them to create a Catholic version of their training that we're going to be rolling out hopefully in Catholic schools from the autumn with a pilot workshop. And I think this is something that's as important as supporting victims and survivors is looking at this preventative work, looking at the next generation coming up, looking at some of these really, really dangerous attitudes that are developing, that if left unchecked, I think the problem will only get worse.
Absolutely. I think it's so important to go, as you say, into schools to talk with young people. And I personally think I'm not an expert in this, but I get the impression that when you allow them to speak openly, when you allow young people that space to say, we can talk about this, for example, even, the huge rise in, young people watching pornography, which, from all the things I've read it's sort of, dulling the emotional sensitivity of young people and creating this new normal of what is normal behavior. There are some of the most searched for words, for example, on pornographic websites, include things, phrases about being violent towards women. And this is creating a norm. And I think, whether we're talking about faith communities or not, I think we need to be open that this world exists and that we need to perhaps also in our faith communities speak a bit more openly about it, because of course it's very taboo in the Catholic Church, in Christian communities, in faith communities. But I think perhaps that means that people go more, they don't talk about it, but they still do it. And so I think that if we create, especially with young people, an atmosphere where we can talk about it, or including, there are so many interlinked issues in society today which affect all of this. For example, you were talking about racial issues, but of course also disability, and other social issues. But of course also, for example, the rise of artificial intelligence, which is currently programmed in a very misogynistic way, unfortunately, because that's the current language in society. And it almost proves the point, doesn't it? That this language is the sort of the norm in society, because a computer has read a million things and said this is the norm. So with all of that, I wondered if you have any closing words, any last remarks about particularly in faith communities, about after this webinar, for example, what can we do next? How can we keep this conversation going? I saw a question in the chat about, how can we access training? Do you have to be nominated by your parish? How can anyone watching this, how can they take the next step and get involved?
In answer to the question about training, we have some of our training is for people working in parishes and for clergy. Some of our training is for anyone in the helping professions, whether it's voluntary or paid role. As much as our training as we can make it is free. We do have some charges for some of our advanced training for counselors and psychotherapists, but we try to make it as accessible as possible. A lot of it's online as well, so people can engage from wherever they are. So if you go to the Caritas Westminster website and have a look at, so it'd be caritaswestminster.org.uk/safe-in-faith. And you can see there, we'll have a list of our upcoming training events. And you can also get in touch with us by email and find out what it is that we have going on. We also have a program at the moment that we're launching called Ask for Mary, where you can encourage your parish to join the Ask for Mary project. What we will do, there's two ways of engaging with Ask for Mary. If it's appropriate, if you've got the resources for your parish to offer its office as a safe space where people in danger can safely use the phone and internet to seek help, we'll train you how to do that safely. Otherwise, we can equip you with posters to put in the toilets and on notice boards to help signpost people to safety. And we have a new role, volunteer role, which is deanery reps who we've just got the first two at the moment, and we're creating the role with them. But we'll be rolling that out further in due course. And that's somebody who can really work with the parishes. So the Ask for Mary project and the training events that we're doing, and encourage use of the signposting toolkit as well.
Great. Thank you so much. It's helpful to have, I always find, a few actions which people can easily undertake. So I think shortly we'll open the floor for questions, but I just had one final question I wanted to ask you, and perhaps this can be then open out into a discussion, or of course, if you have a question, feel free to type it in the chat as well. If someone has, a friend or someone in the parish or someone they know who they think may be a victim, how do they then, what's the first step? For example, do you consult directly with that person? I just wonder, because I think it's probably a question that a lot of people have, is they might think, oh, I'm actually a bit worried about my friend. What do I do?
That's a really good question. And the first thing I would say is what not to do is to speak to the person you think might be harming their friend, even if that person is known to you very well. Because what we know about perpetrators is that if they feel that their abuse has been exposed, it's likely to escalate the violence and escalate the risk. So that would be highly likely to make things worse. So I would recommend not saying anything in front of the perpetrator, to the perpetrator, or to anyone who might not keep things confidential from the perpetrator. But if you do have the opportunity to speak to the person you're worried about in privacy, I would say that you're concerned. I would say why you're concerned. I would offer support, and I would say that they are welcome to speak to you at any time. You might want to offer some signposting information depending on how the conversation goes. I wouldn't expect that person to leap straight away at the idea of help. Sometimes people need time to process that. And that's okay. What you might need to do is sow seeds, first of all. You can also ring any of the helplines as a concerned person and ask for advice, and speak to the experts there about getting advice, and speak to the experts there about what would be the best signposting in your area. So they are absolutely always happy to speak to people who have concerns about a friend or loved one or relative. And what I would do is not leave it there. Sometimes people can become quite defensive. Sometimes people can feel quite ashamed, because we know about abuse is that people who have been victimized carry really inappropriate shame. And so they may respond defensively, they may respond with anger, they may respond protectively over their perpetrator. All of those are actually quite normal responses. Don't let it put you off. Just say that you're here, and you're here if ever they should change their mind and want to speak. Again, what I wouldn't do is become too angry about it, or to be too critical of the person you think is a perpetrator, because that is likely to encourage the person who may be being harmed to feel protective or to feel the need to protect. There's a sort of a psychological triad that comes into play, that would encourage that to happen. So being fairly neutral, fairly muted in your emotions, and fairly calm if you can, but just state why you're concerned and say that you'll be here if they ever want to, and that you can help with information if they need to. or in any other way if you need to. Don't overpromise though, because when someone's that vulnerable, if you promise something and then let them down, that can actually be really devastating, because trust is very hard to do when you've had your trust broken so completely. So that's quite a bit of advice. We do have more, but I think that's probably enough to start with.
Thank you, Nikki. I think it's wonderful advice, and I think very clear advice as well, because, I think most people, if 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men are victims, the chances are the people close to them may have had suspicions as well. And so I think it's very important to have that clear advice about what to do and what not to do. I think was very important as well, because sometimes we have an instinct, an emotional instinct to say stop doing that, or but in fact, as you say, it can be more harmful.
Mm-hmm.
And I firstly want to say thank you. I think we've covered a lot today, this evening. I think the key things that I'll take away are for sure what you just spoke about. How can we approach someone who we're worried about? But also one of the key words for me that's come out of this evening is trust. And whether that be of, in our faith communities, we need to have that trust where we can have people that we know we can go to. And I think it's great that you've given us all ways in which, even the normal, the normal non-experts or non-specialists can also help to build that trust in our faith communities and in our communities more generally as well. Because that's the first step. And I think trust leads to safety. So thank you, Nikki, very, very much for all sharing your wisdom and expertise with us. And I'd like to open the floor for, if we have a few minutes available for questions, if anybody would like to ask a question or to make a comment to engage in the discussion as well. Please do, feel free to just unmute yourself if you're muted. No need to put up any hands or anything.
I'll come in if
Yeah, Raymond.
no one else is ready to come in. Nikki, Steph, thank you. I mean, it's always great to hear from you and great to be in conversation with you. And thank you for the amazing work you do. I think you kind of answered my questions, Nikki. One was about education and schools, and I think you dealt with that really well. Because I still work with quite a lot of schools, and they report, what one teacher told me the other day, that domestic abuse is off the scale, and so I mean, so many of the children coming into school are witnessing domestic abuse and are suffering, as you've often said, they're victims too of domestic abuse, and teachers feel increasingly ill-equipped to deal with it. So I mean, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but the question is, and the parish level, I think you dealt with very well too. But a very specific question comes to mind, and I was just thinking about confession. And I know that in the whole abuse debates, the seal of confession has become quite a live issue. And I wonder if you get any, and I know we've got other people in the call may want to contribute to this, but if in confession a perpetrator is confessing domestic abuse, which sounds to the priest very serious, to the point even when the victim's life is in danger, is that something that should override the seal of confession, or have you got any thoughts or experience on that particular point?
What I'm told by clergy is that what happens much more often in confession is that people being victimized will want to confess. And so making sure that they are very clear that it's not a sin to be victimized. And to have at the ready information about support. I encourage priests to have, again, at the ready information about where to signpost people for behaviour change programmes. That this is something that needs to be done by people with high levels of expertise. It's not something that should be undertaken by a priest, really. But the priest should be, this is where you need to go, and this is very serious, and to be very, very clear about where the church stands on abuse. We are in fact starting a process of exploring this question very deeply with some other experts around the country, and St Mary's University, with the idea of creating some really robust guidance on that. So if you come back to me with that question in a while, I will probably have a fuller answer for you. But at the moment, that's the recommendation that we have.
Thanks, Nikki. Thank you.
I think in part response, Raymond, I don't know whether I'm the only priest on this call, but I think Nikki's right. I mean, I have no recollection of a perpetrator ever having mentioned it in confession, but I have spoken to victims. I suspect getting the message over to clergy that they should not try and deal with it themselves is probably going to take a bit of time, because I suppose as part of the culture that many of us have inherited is that we should be able to deal with everything. In terms of the seal, I think when it has been raised in relation to safeguarding and domestic abuse, the answer has been clear that the priest is not free to divulge what he's told. I suppose there are circumstances in which you could refuse absolution if you didn't think somebody had any intention of not committing abuse again. And what at least I would do is that I would do my best to encourage the person to talk outside the seal to me or to someone else. But that's probably as far as you can go. But I think the position that says that you would not be free to break the seal is pretty clear.
Thank you. Yes.
Could I ask two unrelated questions? The one relates to perpetrators. In your experience, Nikki, can perpetrators be reformed, or is the main solution escape? Is the one thing. And the other was just, I was wondering if you or anyone else has information about what is going on in religious institutions. I know that there are far fewer nuns and so on and so on. So I'm not sure, I'm pretty sure it used to happen. Do you have any facts on any institutions, monasteries or convents, if they still exist, what the status is there?
So the first question, sorry, can you repeat the first question again?
It was about perpetrators. Are they reformable?
Yes, that's it. Yes. So the answer is yes, but it's rare. There are some very robust perpetrator programs, behavioral change programs, and it is possible for somebody to go through a program like that. It's quite rare, I think, for people to change without that intervention. It's also possible for somebody to go through all of that and still be very unsafe at the end of it. So we can't assume that somebody is safe just because they've been through one of these programs. It's very rare for perpetrators to engage in these programs of their own free will. It usually happens when it's been court mandated. So the answer is yes, it is possible, but number one, it's very, very rare. And number two, it's completely out of the control of the person who's being victimized. And so if I'm dealing with the person who's being victimized, who already has been, their control has been completely stolen, I wouldn't be encouraging them to rely on something else that's completely out of their control. I'd be encouraging them to look at what they have the power to control and change. And so with that person, I would be looking at safety seeking. For most people, that means escape. Sometimes somebody absolutely does not want to escape. That can be very frustrating. They absolutely do not want to leave. And what we would do then is we will work with domestic abuse services and we'll create a safety plan to really help that person live as safely as they can in that situation. One of the things I often say is that you can't cure control with more control. And so much as we may wish to rush in as rescuers, we have to be very careful of that instinct because it will be just perceived as more control. So we have to be very patient and we have to, we can let the person know why we're concerned and what we're seeing. That can be very important. But also to respect their choices and support them in their choices and support them with space to make their choices, which is something they probably aren't getting at home. But my focus would always be on safety seeking with somebody who's been victimized. And it happens sometimes that people will come up to me and say, how can I make my partner change? And my answer is always the same, is I can't make your partner change, but we can look at what you can do. And what was your second question?
About institutions.
So by that, do you mean about abuse being perpetrated within institutions or institutions?
Yeah, say nuns or brothers or that type of Catholic that I grew up with. Of course, there are far fewer now. But...
Yeah, we do know it's not something that Safe in Faith currently has the capacity to engage with, although as we grow, it is definitely on my list of things that we want to engage with, because we know this happens and we know that those power dynamics that can happen in families also play out in religious orders and religious communities, and sometimes very harmfully, because the role of spiritual abuse is incredibly powerful when somebody has perhaps taken a vow of obedience to somebody who is abusing them. So that is absolutely something that is on our radar. We don't yet have the capacity to engage with it, but we are aware that it happens. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, we have time for one more quick question before I hand back over to Amanda. So Maureen, you can have the floor for a last quick question in just a minute or two, please. Thanks.
It's not a question, it's a comment. I am on the Gender Equality Committee at the Council of Europe, INGO conference, and this obviously is an issue with us, and it is something that we recognize that it is worldwide, it is cultural, and how do we change the culture, and how do men feel victimized as much as women these days? So we talked about positive masculinity, but what is happening is the whole of society has become so individualistic and self-promoting that family life has broken down, community life has broken down. So what do we do to enable communities to help each other, families to help each other? The church has such a wonderful opportunity in the sacramental programs. I used to belong to marriage care, and the preparation programs for marriage would look at some of these things. And I used to say, but it doesn't start with marriage prep. It should start with the baptismal program, where when families begin to emerge, that young couples are helped to see how to bring up the children positively, how to learn in families how to talk to each other, how to understand each other, listen to each other, and help to resolve conflict there. It really annoys me when the schools have to sort it out and the government has to sort it out. It has to be sorted out in the home with families. So what are we doing as a church to help family life and to enable family life? I have to say that at the World Youth Conference, women's organisations, we are actually concerned about this. So one of our resolutions is to see how we can actually enable family life to prosper and to grow and to make a change in society and community. I could go on for hours, but anyway, I will leave it there.
Thank you, Maureen. Nikki, if you have maybe a 3-word response before.
Yeah, I mean, you know, people growing up in safe families are more skilled at then creating safe families later on. And so you know, and the dehumanization, I think, that is, you didn't use that word, but I think that's what you might be referring to, is the dehumanization of people that we've seen through some of the things that Steph was talking about, through the use of pornography, through AI, and through this growing youth culture, is very disturbing. One thing I would say is that this kind of violence and control in families is more to do with power than conflict. There are difficulties to do with conflict resolution in families that are quite separate from domestic abuse and coercive control, and I think it's quite useful to look at those as separate issues, and to look at them separately. They're both very important. They both cause a lot of problems, but to look at the balance of power within family units as well as within communities, including church communities, is, I think, very, very important. So thank you.
Thank you, Nikki, and again, thank you to the Pastoral Review for the opportunity to have such a rich conversation this evening. And I strongly encourage and invite anyone watching this to visit the Safe in Faith website and to see if there's anything that you can do in your local community as well. So I now hand back over to Amanda and close the webinar. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Nikki. We had a conversation, didn't we, before this started, and I can see why you do what you do. You're you know, you're so gifted. So thank you so much for, you know, just really bringing home to us what we can do and how we can probably be a small part in the cog of making all of this a bit better. But you've certainly made it real for us. So thank you for that. And thanks, Steph, for hosting this webinar for the Pastoral Review. Coming up, we have tomorrow evening, 6 till 7, Reimagining Catholicism from Inside Out. We're forgetting about the usual debates. We've got a theologian and priest, James Allison, who'll give us fresh, fearless insights into Christianity rooted in tradition, but freed from outdated narratives. Looking forward to that one. So that's at 6 o'clock tomorrow evening. And then coming up on Friday this week, we've got a busy week. We've got Leadership and Legacy, the Future of Women in the Church. It's the Tablets one-day conference. It'll be based at Boreham House in Chelmsford, and it's sponsored by CCLA and Newhall School. And we have a full packed day. It's going to be absolutely scorching as well. So if we're going to have a scorching day, we might as well have it somewhere lovely. So if you haven't booked your ticket for that yet, then please do just go onto the Tablet website and have a look at the details of that. And then also coming up a bit later on in the month, 30th of July and 31st, we've got Augustinian Spirituality, the Theory and the Practice. The way that works is we've got one session on the theory. This is Pope Leo's spirituality, so it'll be really good to sort of get a bit more information about it. And then on the Thursday evening, we have the practice. So we will be actually immersing ourselves in Augustinian spirituality. If you feel inclined, then please do join us for that. There's still plenty pilgrimages on the Tablet website that you can access, have a look at the details. And if you're not a subscriber to the Pastoral Review or the Tablet, then if you go to www.thetablet.co.uk, you can find all the details of how to subscribe to either the Pastoral Review or the Tablet. On behalf of myself and all of the people who bring these webinars to you, our guests, Steph and Nikki, I'd just like to wish you a very good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Take care now. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Thanks very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.